Sad da čujemo što dakle politički analitičar iz Brisela Nikola Svijet kaže o tim uzrocima ekonomskih i političkih teškoća u Velikoj Britaniji.
I think it's more because of Brexit, although the pandemic plays a role. And the fact is that Brexit is a huge policy choice for the UK that was based on lies. It was based on an untruth. It was based on the idea that Britain outside the EU would be freer and richer and better. And the fact is that outside the European Union, cutting links with your major trading partners, your main neighbours, this isn't a winning strategy economically, it isn't a winning strategy politically. And so the British public is now getting used to the fact that their system has been weakened by a choice that they made. And British politicians don't have the courage to put it in those terms to British voters. There is a bit of a sort of, how can you tell voters that it's entirely their fault, the problems they're going through? The pandemic did not help. But what also did not help was the policy of successive Conservative governments, that it should be possible to get more for less, that it should be possible to get decent public services while also cutting public spending. There's no country in the world where that can work. And I think they're paying the price for fantasy politics, for fantasy economics over the last few years. When you make it more difficult to trade with your immediate neighbours, this just isn't something that helps economically. The whole point of the European Union back in the olden days was to lower trade barriers, to increase the possibility of trading between different countries. This, of course, is why Croatia wanted to join back in the olden days. This is why every country in the Western Balkans wants to join the European Union. It's not just about a civilizational democratic box-ticking goal. It's about being part of a continent-wide economy in which your goods can compete with the goods from other countries, and in which your workers are able to compete with the workers from other countries. The British have cut themselves off from that, and that comes at a price which they are paying.
Kad ste spomenuli Sjevernu Irsku, dakle tu je taj nastao veliki problem sa irskom granicom između Sjeverne Irske i Republike Irske. Pa poslušajmo sad ponovo našeg kolegu Whitea iz Brisela, koji je inače porijeklom upravo iz Sjeverne Irske.
Certainly those of us from both parts of Ireland, both the north where I come from and the Republic, which is independent, we could see very clearly that Brexit would create a lot of difficulties. When you divide a territory which has been a single customs space, a single agricultural space, there are going to be consequences. What made things worse was that the British then signed up to an agreement with the EU that it now turns out they had no intention of respecting. And that causes a real weakening of trust. The fact that the British have signed an international agreement and then said, well, they didn't like it that much after all. Now, it's possible to see a pragmatic landing space. It's possible to see a space where you find a pragmatic workarounds to make the border in Northern Ireland, or between Northern Ireland and the Republic, where you make that border more smooth, more transparent, and also where you don't have too big an impact on trade between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. It's also completely ridiculous to say that this is a threat to sovereignty. There are many cases of countries where you have a particular part of their sovereign territory that has different customs arrangements to the rest of the country because of geography. So if there's a goodwill towards finding a pragmatic solution, it can be done. The problem is that the British have given the impression, certainly under both Boris Johnson and under Liz Truss, that they're more interested in having the fight than in finding the answer, and that having the fight is how they intend to stay in power. With Sunak, that's not so clear, and it does seem, certainly the messages that he is giving off at the moment seem to indicate that he's more interested in finding a workable solution. But the fact is that a lot of political goodwill has been burned, and willfully burned, by the British over the last 3 years. And that too comes at a price.
To isto pitanje smo postavili Nikolasu Whiteu, pa za kraj poslušajmo i njega kako on predviđa te odnose.
Geography plays an important part here. And the UK cannot liberate itself from the European continent It retains a land border with the EU. It's only a half-hour train journey from Calais to Folkestone. So Britain remains very closely linked to Europe, whether it likes it or not. The question is how that is going to be managed. And it seems to me fairly clear that under the current government, it's going to be very difficult, that the Conservative Party as a whole wants to see leaders who fight with Europe and not leaders who work with Europe. So I'm afraid, I think we're going to be locked into this very negative dynamic while the Conservatives remain in power, which probably means for the next 2 years.